She sat on death row for 30 years. Everyone called her a monster. No one wanted to hear the truth, but on the day of her execution, when she uttered her last words, subscribe. Write in the comments which city you're from. It's interesting to see where people are watching us. The steel door let out a tired creak as it closed behind the guard, sealing the cold, narrow cell once again in silence. The fluorescent light above flickered with a soft buzz, casting long shadows on the concrete floor. In the far corner, on a cot no softer than stone, sat Elsie Mae Johnson. Her frame was slight, bones pressing gently against skin, worn by time and the slow erosion of hope. The years in confinement had carved their way into her hands, now trembling slightly as they cradled a small, creased photograph. A boy, no older than 3, stared back with wide, curious eyes. His smile was shy, and his arms outstretched, as if forever frozen in the act of running toward someone who would catch him. Elsie studied the image with a gaze that was neither desperate nor nostalgic. It was reverent. That photo, now faded at the corners, was all she had left of a moment in her life that had become both a source of pain and the reason she endured. Around her neck, under the collar of her prison uniform, hung a simple silver chain with a tiny pendant, a charm shaped like a crescent moon. She would touch it sometimes without noticing, as though grounding herself to something that the walls could not take from her. It was the last evening she would live through. She knew this with the same certainty that she knew the weight of her own name. Tomorrow morning, they would walk her down the corridor, strap her into the chair, and flip the switch. There would be witnesses, press, legal observers, officials, none of whom had known her, and none who would remember her after the news cycle ran dry. She had seen too many faces come and go in this place, each one pretending not to hear her whispers, not to see the humanity that still flickered in her tired eyes. Outside her cell, the rhythm of boots echoed softly, moving past without pause. The women in neighboring units had fallen quiet too. They always did the night before a scheduled execution. It was a strange kind of morning, silent, shared, and steeped in powerlessness. Even in a place where life was suspended between cold metal and rules, death arrived as a guest that no one welcomed, but everyone prepared for. Elsie reached up and adjusted the fraying blanket draped over her shoulders. The air had grown colder lately, the concrete soaking it in like a sponge. She leaned back against the wall, closed her eyes, and let her thoughts wander, as she had done every night for years. But tonight was different. There would be no more tomorrows to correct the stories told about her. No more time to explain what truly happened. She had tried. God knew she had tried. But the voices that mattered had already made up their minds long ago. Somewhere beyond these walls, a television crackled in the rec room. Through the small speaker vent near the ceiling, she could hear the anchor's practiced voice. Tomorrow morning at 7:15 a.m. Central Time, Elsie Mae Johnson, convicted in 1993 of child abduction, will be executed by electric chair. The case, which shook Mississippi decades ago, remains one of the most infamous crimes involving a minor in state history. She didn't need to hear the rest. She'd memorized the script from all those years ago, the same words repeated in courtrooms, on headlines, in whispered conversations in grocery stores. They called her a monster, a danger to children, a manipulative liar hiding behind grandmotherly eyes. Her name had been painted in such darkness that even strangers flinched when they heard it. The first time someone spit at her in prison, she had tried to explain. But words had little weight against the tide of public hatred. No one wanted to hear her story. only the version that fit into a neat column or a soundbite. She had stopped defending herself, not because she gave up, but because she realized it didn't matter anymore. The trial had ended long before she stepped foot in the courtroom. Her public image had been sealed the moment they arrested her. One look at her, a poor, older woman from the wrong neighborhood, and the rest had written itself. The guards were no different. Some sneered when they passed, others pretended she wasn't there at all. Occasionally, a younger one would hesitate, unsure whether to pity her or fear her. But even they didn't ask questions. Not really. No one ever had. A sudden rattle at the door jolted her from her thoughts. It opened just enough for a tray to slide through before clanking shut again. Supper. It was always the same. Lukewarm potatoes, dry bread, and a small carton of milk. Elsie looked at it, untouched, and then turned her eyes back to the photograph in her lap. She didn't have much appetite. The hunger she felt wasn't physical, it was the aching need to be seen, really seen, before she left this world. She wondered where he was now. The boy. Grown, maybe. Safe, she hoped. She imagined him taller, with that same open expression, maybe playing basketball with friends, maybe attending college. Maybe he didn't even remember her. Or maybe he did, but only through someone else's poisoned retelling of who she was. That thought hurt more than the idea of dying. Elsie closed her eyes and took a slow breath. Her heart didn't race, though there was heaviness in her chest. Fear had long since faded, replaced by a dull resignation. But deeper still, buried beneath years of silence and solitude, there was another feeling, something close to peace. Not because she had forgiven the world for what it had done to her, but because she knew what she had done, and why. She had protected him, even if the world called it kidnapping, even if no one believed her, even if it meant losing everything. Some things were worth it. The clock ticked on. Each second felt like dust on her skin. She turned her gaze toward the ceiling, tracing the cracks she had memorized years ago. There was a long, jagged one that reminded her of a river, a curved one that resembled a question mark. She had created constellations from them on sleepless nights, little stories carved into concrete. And still, the question lingered in the back of her mind, unshakable even now. Would he ever know the truth? The silence deepened as night stretched on. Somewhere down the hall, a woman sobbed quietly into her mattress. Another hummed a hymn under her breath, the sounds of the condemned echoing off steel and stone. Elsie slowly lay down, curling slightly on her side. She clutched the photo close, resting it beneath her pillow like a prayer. She whispered his name, not out loud, not for anyone else to hear, just for herself, just for him. Outside her cell, a guard paused. He was new and unsure whether to look inside or keep walking. Something about her presence unsettled him. Not because she looked dangerous. Quite the opposite. It was the calmness in her eyes, the quiet dignity in her posture that made her feel unknown. He moved on, the lights dimmed further. Somewhere, a buzzer sounded. Shift change. Elsie remained still. Her breathing slowed, her hands finally resting. Sleep would not come easily, but she would wait, just as she had waited all these years, for someone to listen, for someone to care, for someone to finally ask not what she did, but why. And when the morning came, whether or not anyone had listened, she would walk that final corridor with her head held high. Because whatever the world had said, whatever they had written, she knew who she was, and she knew what she had done. Not for hate, not for harm, but for love, for him, for the boy no one ever asked about again. When the sun rose over Jackson, Mississippi the next morning, its golden light filtered through the wide windows of the district attorney's office, illuminating shelves packed with files, binders, and boxes filled with forgotten names and closed cases. On the 5th floor, Benjamin Harris sat behind a government-issued desk, staring blankly at the screen of his computer, the remnants of a stale bagel untouched on a napkin beside him. Ben was new. Just 6 months into the job and still adjusting to the suffocating rhythm of government law work, he had grown used to the routine. Check in, check boxes, sign off. Every file, no matter how dramatic or disturbing, eventually turned into a matter of formality. He had been trained to keep emotions separate from the process, but something about the folder on his desk made that separation feel unnatural. The red label across the front read, Johnson, Elsie May, Execution Protocol Review. It had been slid under his door earlier that morning with a sticky note that said, Finalized checklist, scheduled for Thursday. P. He opened it, expecting just another quick administrative review. That was all this was supposed to be. A final look at documentation to ensure that everything had been legally observed before the state carried out its sentence. No need to read too deeply. No need to question the past. The file should have been straightforward. The woman had been convicted nearly 3 decades ago of kidnapping a child and was sentenced to death. High profile at the time. Apparently a national scandal. All that was left was to confirm that the paperwork lined up. But as he flipped through the pages, an uncomfortable feeling crept over him. There were gaps. It started with small things, missing timestamps, incomplete transcripts, but as he moved deeper into the file, the inconsistencies grew harder to ignore. The original arrest report was there, yet the witness statements were generic, vague, and clearly edited. Most disturbingly, the name of the child's father was entirely absent, not redacted, omitted. Page after page referred to him as the guardian or the complainant, but never by name. And nowhere in the file was there a single line of testimony from him. Ben leaned back in his chair, frowning. That wasn't standard. In a case where a child was allegedly kidnapped, the identity of the custodial parent was central. You didn't just leave it out unless there was a reason. He flipped forward again, searching for testimony from the defendant, Elsie May herself. All he found were short responses, most of them limited to yes or no. Her lawyer had raised no objections, asked no questions. Ben recognized the name of the attorney, now long retired, and remembered hearing whispers about how overworked he had been in the early 90s. Assigned defense, minimum effort, a conviction waiting to happen. The deeper Ben read, the more questions he had. The child, according to the file, was found unharmed, clean, and well-fed. Medical evaluations had shown no signs of mistreatment. In fact, there was a note from one physician saying the child appeared alert, responsive, and emotionally stable. That didn't match the narrative painted in the prosecution's summary, which described Elsie May as a manipulative figure who exploited a vulnerable child for her own mental delusions. Then came a line in the pre-sentencing report that made him pause entirely. The defendant's own explanation for her actions was deemed inconsistent and irrelevant to sentencing. Defense chose not to pursue further evidence of psychological or contextual justification. Ben sat still, staring at those words. Inconsistent and irrelevant. The more he studied the file, the more it seemed less like a well-resolved case and more like something deliberately buried. How could someone be sentenced to death with this little consideration for motive or circumstance? And why did no one seem to question the total erasure of the child's home life? He stood up and crossed the room to the tall file cabinet labeled Closed Cases, Capital Sentencing. Pulling open the drawer, he scanned the labels until he found a companion binder. People v. Johnson, Archive Records, Partial. Inside were older papers, some handwritten, others typed on yellowing letterhead. Near the back of the binder, stuck between two evaluation reports, was a photocopy of a form he hadn't seen in the main file. A handwritten complaint submitted by a woman named Lily Emerson. Ben froze. It was dated 6 weeks before Elsie Mae's arrest. The form had been submitted to the Department of Family Services and contained 2 short but urgent paragraphs. My husband has become dangerous. I fear for my safety and for the safety of my son. I'm requesting emergency protection and will not return home until I'm assured he is safe from harm. The document had been stamped as received, but there was no record of follow-up, no evidence of a social worker visit. Nothing about the complaint had made it into the court record. It had simply disappeared. Ben stared at the page, heart pounding. If this woman, Lily Emerson, had been the boy's mother, and she had vanished shortly before Elsie Mae's arrest, what happened to her? He pulled out his phone and searched her name through the county registry. There was only one record. Lily Emerson, deceased, March 1993. No obituary, no cause of death listed in the basic index. Ben felt the floor shift under him. Back at his desk, he laid out the papers side by side, drawing connections. A woman vanishes after warning about danger at home. An older woman appears with the same child days later. The child is unharmed. The older woman is labeled a kidnapper, tried and sentenced without any effort to explore context or motive. No follow-up on the mother. No mention of the father. Only silence. He picked up the phone and called his supervisor. "Hey, I've got a few questions about the Johnson case." A pause, then a tired voice replied, "Final review, right? Just sign off and move on, Harris. We've all seen that file." "I know, but there's a lot missing. Like, why wasn't the child's father named in the trial and—" "Don't go there," the voice interrupted sharply. "I'm serious. That's old fire, and no good comes from poking it. The department's not interested in reopening a can of worms 3 decades sealed. Just check the boxes and file it." Ben hung up without answering. He sat still for several long minutes, feeling the weight of silence press against him. There was something wrong, deeply, systemically wrong with what he was seeing. But worse than the errors was the clear sense that no one had ever tried to fix them. The case had been convenient. A scapegoat had been provided, and the public had been satisfied. The system moved on. But what if the scapegoat was innocent? He gathered the papers back into the folder, slipped it under his arm, and left his office. Downstairs, in the records department, he requested access to older physical archives, specifically hospital records, Department of Family Services logs, and any law enforcement files from early 1993. Most of it was missing, but not all. From the dusty metal shelves, he pulled a slim box labeled Emerson, Lily, Medical Intake, Restricted. The nurse on duty raised an eyebrow as he carried it past but said nothing. Back at a quiet reading desk, Ben opened the box and slowly paged through it. There were 2 ER reports. Both listed bruises, one included a concussion. The attending physician noted domestic abuse suspected and patient afraid to identify partner due to fear of retaliation. One phrase had been underlined by hand. Protective measures recommended. Follow-up scheduled. Patient did not return. Ben closed the box, heart hammering. By the time he got back to his office, it was nearly dark. The city hummed beyond the tinted windows, indifferent as always. He sat down and looked again at the red-labeled folder. It no longer looked like routine paperwork. It looked like a time bomb that had gone off long ago, and no one had cared about the wreckage left behind. He glanced at the clock. 27 hours until the scheduled execution. He picked up the phone and dialed the number for the state penitentiary. "This is Benjamin Harris from the DA's office," he said, steadying his voice. "I'd like to arrange a meeting with inmate Elsie Mae Johnson as soon as possible." The voice on the other end hesitated. "Purpose?" "Legal review," he answered, and then, after a beat, added, "She may have been convicted under false or incomplete testimony." A pause. "We'll need to clear it. Might take some time." Ben leaned forward, gripping the receiver. "Then start now, because we may be about to kill an innocent woman." And for the first time in his brief career, he felt something shift, not just in the case, but in himself. He didn't want to be the kind of man who looked away. The drive to the state penitentiary was long, cutting through miles of flat land and ghostly towns that seemed permanently caught between then and now. Ben Harris kept his eyes on the road, the folder heavy in his lap even though it wasn't thick. There weren't many pages inside, just a few medical records, a handwritten complaint, and a child's intake summary from a forgotten emergency room visit. But the implications of what he had found far outweighed the paper's weight. He hadn't slept. His thoughts had looped through every inch of the case, obsessively retracing steps, cross-referencing names, timestamps, signatures. 1,000 details, each casting a longer shadow than the last. The question that haunted him was no longer, was she guilty? It had become, why didn't anyone ever ask? He arrived at the prison under an overcast sky, the kind that made the world feel dim even at noon. After being patted down and signed in, he was led through a maze of corridors that smelled of bleach and iron. Guards passed without speaking. Cameras watched everything. As he walked, he couldn't shake the image of Elsie Mae as she had appeared in the old mugshot. Small, tired, unsmiling, her eyes carrying something deeper than resignation, something almost defiant. The interview room was sterile, lined with metal and glass. A single chair waited behind a bolted-down table. When the door opened and she entered under escort, Ben rose. She was older now, much older than that photograph, yet the same quiet strength remained in her posture. The guards chained her hands to the table and stepped back. She looked at him with the weariness of someone who had stopped expecting anything good a long time ago. "You wanted to speak with me," she said simply. Her voice was low but steady. Ben nodded. "Thank you for agreeing." She shrugged. Didn't have anything better planned. He smiled just a little, but she didn't. "I've been reviewing your case," he said. "The official one and the parts that didn't make it into the courtroom." Her expression didn't change. If anything, she seemed amused by his use of the word official. "I found records about a woman named Lily Emerson," he continued. "She filed a complaint about domestic abuse just weeks before your arrest. I believe she's the boy's mother." A long silence followed. Elsie lowered her eyes to her chained hands. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Yes," she said, "that was her name." Ben waited. "She was kind," Elsie added. "Quiet, always nervous, even when she smiled. We met at the clinic. I used to help out part-time back when I still had my license. She'd bring her little boy in with her sometimes. Sweetest child you ever saw. Never cried, not even when he had a fever. Just held on to her like he knew she needed him more than he needed her." Her voice wavered slightly on that last sentence. He was small, barely 3, loved juice boxes and those little toy cars. She used to leave him with me sometimes, just for a couple hours while she ran errands. Said I was the only person she trusted. Ben leaned forward. What happened to her? Elsie was quiet for a moment. She started coming in with bruises, arm, neck, once with a split lip. Always had an excuse. You know the kind, fell down the stairs, bumped into the cabinet. I knew better, we all did, but no one ever said anything out loud. She wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet. She stared past him toward a corner of the room. Then, one day, she showed up shaken, said she had filed a report, told me he'd threatened to take the boy if she ever tried to leave. She said, if something happens to me, I want you to take him. I thought she was just scared, talking like people do when they're in the middle of panic. Her hands clenched slowly into fists. 2 days later, she was gone. Ben felt a chill crawl up the back of his neck. Gone, he repeated. Disappeared, Elsie said. I went to her apartment when she didn't show up for a shift. The door was wide open, lights on, her purse still on the kitchen table. The boy was alone, crying in the bedroom. His little arm had a red mark, like someone grabbed him too hard. She exhaled shakily. I didn't think. I just picked him up and left. I drove for hours. Found a cheap motel by the river, paid cash, kept the TV on so he wouldn't feel so alone. He clung to me for days. Wouldn't eat unless I sat with him. Wouldn't sleep unless he was curled up right next to me. Ben's chest ached with the weight of what he was hearing. Did you try to go to the police? I was going to, she said quietly. I really was. But then I saw his face on the news. They were calling me a kidnapper, said I was mentally unstable, that I had lured him away. They never even mentioned her, his mother, just said unidentified custodial guardian. That's when I knew. They weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for a story that made sense to them. She looked up at Ben, her eyes steady now. They found us on the 4th day, not the police. Men in suits, clean-shaven, polite, but cold. They didn't ask me questions, didn't tell me where he was going, just took him. When I screamed, they threatened to charge me with assault. One of them smiled as they put me in the car. Ben swallowed hard. Do you know who they were? Elsie nodded once. Private security. He had his own people, not from the state. That man, he wasn't just dangerous, he was connected. He made things disappear. Lily, her file, me, everything. She reached into her jumpsuit pocket and slowly slid a small item across the table. It was the same pendant he'd seen in the evidence photo, a crescent moon on a delicate chain. At the back, barely visible, were tiny engraved initials. R.J.E. Ben stared at it. I kept it, Elsie said. It was his. He wore it every day. I told him it was his lucky moon. Ben finally spoke, voice hoarse. Do you know who the father is? Her lips tightened. I do. But saying his name here wouldn't help you, or me. He's still out there, still in office, still powerful. You speak against him and you'll find your life ruined before the week's out. Ben's thoughts spun, but he forced himself to stay grounded. Why didn't this come out at trial? She gave a bitter smile. My lawyer told me to keep quiet. Said if I spoke about things I couldn't prove, I'd get life instead of death. Funny, isn't it? A life of silence, or death with no truth. She leaned back, her wrists still chained to the table, but her voice full of an old, burning certainty. I wasn't trying to steal him. I was trying to save him. But nobody wanted to hear that. Not then. Not ever. Ben reached for the pendant, cradling it gently in his fingers. He felt the cool weight of it, the small curve, the edges smoothed by years of touch. "I believe you," he said. She smiled again, softer this time. "That's a first." He stood, his thoughts already racing with what he would do next. The phone calls, the records, the press if it came to that. The clock was ticking, but he had something now, a thread to pull, a voice to amplify. As he turned to go, she said his name. He stopped. "Whatever happens," she said, "thank you for listening. Even if it's too late, it means something." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The guard opened the door and Ben stepped through, the pendant in his hand and the truth ringing in his ears. Outside, the clouds hung lower than before, and the wind picked up, sharp and insistent. But for the first time in days, Ben felt something else stirring inside him. Resolve. Elsie's story wasn't over, and neither was his. The hallway outside the visitation room was colder than it had any right to be. As Ben stepped back into the corridor, his skin prickled with something more than the air. It was the weight of everything he'd just heard pressing down on his chest. The metal door clanked shut behind him, sealing off the quiet strength of Elsie Mae Johnson. He walked down the corridor with slow, deliberate steps, the pendant she had given him still resting in his hand. His fingers curled around it instinctively, as if it were a lifeline. He drove back to Jackson in silence. The roads stretched endlessly ahead, framed by pine and pecan trees blurred by motion. The towns he passed seemed unchanged, still living in the same forgotten time Elsie had been buried in. Her story echoed through his mind, each sentence carving out new questions and new anger. If everything she said was true, and in his gut he believed it was, then not only had a woman been condemned unjustly, but an entire apparatus had conspired to keep it that way. By the time he returned to his apartment, it was nearly midnight. He didn't turn on the television. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table with the documents spread out in front of him. Medical reports, family services complaints, incomplete trial transcripts, and that simple crescent pendant. The engraving caught the light softly. RJE, a name hidden in plain sight, just like everything else about this case. He didn't need to guess who the initials belonged to. He had already begun pulling the thread. The name he had uncovered in the family services system was Robert James Elwood, a then state senator with significant financial and political influence. That influence had grown over the years. Now, he held a seat in Congress, a man with power, connections, and a reputation for philanthropy and community restoration efforts. Smiling in suits, shaking hands in photo ops. A man so entrenched in the state's politics that the mere whisper of accusation would ripple like dynamite through the system, and Elsie Mae had been his liability. Ben pored over newspaper articles from that time. March 1993. The boy's disappearance had been headline news, but nowhere was the identity of the father mentioned. Every article referenced the mother vaguely, often without a name. When the child was recovered, the headlines pivoted. Suddenly, it wasn't about a family in crisis. It was about a deranged woman who had stolen a boy from a safe and loving environment. No follow-ups, no deeper questions. No mention of Lily Emerson again. He looked at the clock. 19 hours until the scheduled execution. The next morning, he requested a formal meeting with the district attorney, but was told the DA was unavailable. He asked for a meeting with the state public defender's office, but received a similarly curt dismissal. The moment he mentioned Elsie Mae Johnson's name, doors began to close. People who had been cordial days earlier now looked at him like he'd grown a second head. One assistant, who usually offered to refill his coffee, wouldn't even meet his eyes. It wasn't subtle. They didn't want the case touched. Not now. Not after all these years. And especially not when the person behind the curtain had so much to lose. Ben didn't care. He returned to the archive and spent hours digging through the personnel files at the Department of Family Services. Most of the documents had been scanned and destroyed, but a few handwritten logs remained in the bottom drawers. One name kept reappearing: Karen Holtz, the social worker assigned to Lily Emerson's complaint. Ben found her number through an outdated staff directory and called. The voice on the other end was tired, guarded. "This is Karen." "Miss Holtz, my name is Benjamin Harris. I'm an attorney in Jackson reviewing a death penalty case, and I believe you may have been involved in the original investigation regarding Lily Emerson in 1993. A long pause followed. "I don't do interviews," she said. "That case almost cost me my job." "I'm not a reporter," Ben said quickly. "I'm trying to stop an execution that shouldn't happen. Please, I just need the truth." Silence again. Then, "Meet me at the old post office on Shelby Street. Noon." She hung up before he could say thank you. He arrived early, waiting in his car and watching the boarded-up building across the street. When Karen Holtz finally stepped out of her vehicle, she looked just like he imagined, worn, distant, and cautious. Her gray hair was pulled back tightly, and her coat flapped in the wind like something from a different era. "You know what you're doing?" she asked without greeting. "No," Ben admitted, "but I know she didn't deserve this." Karen nodded, her eyes scanning the empty street. "We all knew, those of us on the ground. Lily came to us terrified. I begged my supervisor to push her request through, but a day later, I got a call telling me to evaluate the situation. And then, nothing. I was pulled off the case. Next thing I heard, she was dead, and Elsie was arrested." "Did you know who the father was?" "Of course," Karen said bitterly. "Everyone did, but no one would dare say his name. He had friends in the Attorney General's office, judges, even a couple news editors. He buried her story before the ink dried." She looked at Ben hard. "You're swimming in deep water now. You really want to save her? Then you'd better move fast. They'll run out that clock no matter what proof you put in front of them." Ben thanked her and rushed back to his office. He scanned the signed intake form Karen had brought him, a photocopy of Lily's original complaint, this time with the father's name clearly listed, Robert James Elwood. He had what he needed. Now he had to make someone listen. By 3 p.m., he was on the phone with a federal clerk, filing for an emergency stay of execution and attaching every supporting document he had. The motion was submitted, and the waiting began. Calls went unanswered. Texts were ignored. His inbox filled with auto-replies and vague deferrals. It was as though the entire system had decided to freeze him out. At 5:40 p.m., his phone rang. It was the prison warden. "The governor's office hasn't responded," the man said. "Unless you have a federal injunction in hand, we proceed." Ben's chest tightened. "You can't." "I don't make the rules, son." Ben hung up, palms clammy, and stared at the clock. Barely 13 hours remained. He packed his files, drove to the courthouse, and walked into the office of a local news outlet, clutching the evidence. "If I can't stop this through the courts," he told the editor, "I'll stop it through the people." The woman listened, flipping through the file. When she reached the photos of Lily's bruises and the medical reports, she stopped. Her fingers tightened around the pages. "I'll run it," she said, "tonight. But you'd better pray it spreads fast." By midnight, the story was online. Headline: Execution looms despite shocking new evidence in 1993. Kidnapping case. Ben sat in his apartment, refreshing the article again and again. Comments poured in, shares multiplied, people were asking questions, demanding answers, but still no word from the courts, no order from the governor. At 6:10 a.m., his phone rang again. It was the penitentiary. "You have 1 hour," the voice said. Ben grabbed the file and ran. He didn't bother changing clothes. He didn't stop to think. He would fight until the last second. Because Elsie Mae Johnson's life was worth more than silence. The sun had not yet risen when Elsie Mae was awakened by the clanging of the cell doors and the dull thunder of boots in the corridor. The familiar sounds carried a different weight today. They did not mark the beginning of another routine morning, nor the shift change of indifferent guards. Today, they marked the end. At least, that was what everyone expected. The footsteps stopped just outside her cell. A key turned with a heavy, final sound, and the door opened slowly. 2 officers stood there in full execution protocol gear, pressed uniforms, gloves, eyes deliberately blank. Elsie sat up without waiting for instruction. She had slept little, and when she did, it was a shallow, restless sleep, full of fragmented memories and echoes of voices long silenced. Still, her hands were steady as she pulled the blanket from her lap and placed it on the cot, folding it neatly out of habit. They shackled her wrists, then her ankles, moving without words. One of them, a younger man with a clean face and twitching jaw, avoided looking at her directly. The other, older and heavier, performed each movement with the dull professionalism of someone who had done this before. Neither of them addressed her by name. They simply gestured toward the corridor. She nodded once and stepped forward. As she walked, the chains clinking with each careful step, the corridor stretched before her like a tunnel between worlds. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, their buzz echoing against the cinder block walls. Her slippers scuffed against the concrete floor. There was a coldness in the hallway that settled into her bones, but it was not unfamiliar. She had lived in cold for decades. Cold air, cold glances, cold justice. She didn't look around as they passed the empty cells of the other inmates. The women inside were silent but awake. She could feel their presence, their watching, some in prayer, others holding their breath. A few had whispered her name in the night. One had pressed her palm to the wall as if to offer her some small measure of human contact. But now, in these last steps, Elsie was alone. At the end of the hallway stood the chamber, sterile, windowless, unforgiving. 2 guards flanked the steel door, standing as still as statues. When she arrived, they stepped aside. The older officer beside her pulled a key from his belt and inserted it into the lock. The door opened with a mechanical hiss, and the air inside was colder still. She stepped into the room as though it were another cell, only with brighter lights and more wires. The chair stood in the center, bolted to the floor, leather straps hanging loose like the arms of some beast waiting to devour. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and metal. A priest stood in the far corner, eyes lowered, his hands folded around a small Bible. A warden, 2 supervisors, a legal observer, and a doctor were also present. Each avoided her gaze in different ways. She was guided to the chair and slowly lowered into it. The leather was stiff, unwelcoming. She winced slightly as her back pressed against it. The young officer crouched to secure her ankles, while the older one began to strap down her wrists. The priest approached, murmuring something about last rites. She nodded, but did not respond. Her thoughts were elsewhere. Not on heaven nor salvation, but on a little boy with wide eyes and quiet sobs, curled in her arms in a motel room she could barely remember the name of. One by one, the straps tightened. Chest, thighs, shoulders. The metal cap waited on a small tray nearby, wires already trailing from it like the roots of some monstrous tree. The technician by the control panel adjusted a few dials, his eyes flicking occasionally toward the observation window. The warden cleared his throat. "Does the prisoner wish to make a final statement?" Elsie's mouth was dry. She licked her lips and lifted her chin slightly. Her voice was soft but carried through the room. "I did what I thought was right," she said. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I tried to protect a child when no one else would. If that's a sin, then let it be on my soul." There was a pause, as if no one quite knew what to do with her words. Then the warden nodded to the technician. The man stepped forward, lifting the cap. "Wait!" The voice rang out like a gunshot. The door to the chamber burst open, and a figure stumbled inside, breathless and wild-eyed. Ben Harris stood in the doorway, a thick file clutched in one hand, his tie askew, sweat darkening the fabric at his collar. Behind him, a guard tried to pull him back, but the warden held up a hand. "What is the meaning of this?" the warden demanded. "I have a stay," Ben gasped, his voice cracking. "Federal injunction just issued." He thrust forward a sheet of paper, the seal still fresh at the top. The legal observer stepped forward and took it, scanning quickly. His eyes widened slightly. "It's real," he said. "Effective immediately. The execution is suspended." Chaos rippled through the room. The guards hesitated. The technician stepped away from the chair, hands trembling. The warden cursed under his breath and motioned for the straps to be removed. Elsie's head had fallen forward during the commotion. Now she lifted it slowly, eyes meeting Ben's across the room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she gave him the smallest nod, not of gratitude, but of understanding. The guards unfastened the straps, one by one. Her limbs tingled with sudden freedom, numb from pressure. The young officer helped her to her feet, his grip gentler than before. Ben stepped closer, clutching the folder to his chest. "You're not done yet," he said quietly. She looked at him, and for the first time in years, her eyes held something close to hope. The rest of the day passed in fragments. Interviews, paperwork, medical evaluations. She was returned to her cell, but not as a condemned woman. The chains were lighter, the air less sharp. Outside, the media stirred. The story had broken. People were asking questions, demanding answers. The governor's office issued a statement. The court called for review. For the first time in 3 decades, the silence surrounding Elsie Mae Johnson began to break. Late that night, Ben returned to the prison. She sat in the same corner, her hands folded around the pendant once more. He was allowed into the cell. No glass between them. No chains. "They're reopening the case," he said. "I don't know what the outcome will be yet, but they'll have to hear the whole story now. All of it." She nodded. "I still don't know what happened to him," she said after a pause. "The boy." "We'll find out," Ben promised. "We have to." She looked down at the charm in her hand. If he's safe, it was worth it, all of it. He sat beside her, not speaking. Outside the barred window, the wind had picked up. Leaves rustled against the brick. Somewhere in the distance, a train called out into the night. "You saved my life," she said eventually. "No," Ben replied. "You saved his. I just made someone listen." She smiled faintly and leaned back against the wall. then maybe the world isn't beyond repair after all. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was full of questions yet unanswered, full of time not yet lost, full of a story not yet done. And outside, the dawn began to rise. Elsie sat alone in her cell, the thin morning light filtering through the high window, dust dancing quietly in the narrow beam. Her hands, still unsteady from the restraints, rested on her lap. Though the straps had been removed, and her name no longer sat at the top of a schedule marked for death, the weight inside her had not lightened. She was alive, yes, but alive was not free. The door had not opened to absolution, only to possibility. The silence in the cell was different now. It wasn't the smothering silence of resignation, but the brittle, delicate quiet that came after a storm, when everything trembles, when the wreckage is still being tallied. She leaned her head against the cool wall, her eyes closed, listening. In the corridor beyond, there were no voices yet, no calls, no footsteps, only the low hum of electricity and her own breath. She had slept for only an hour. Her mind was restless. Every time her eyes closed, they dragged her back through time. Lily's frightened face, the bruises she tried to hide, the boy's tiny arms clutching her neck in the dark motel room, the sound of laughter from behind thick office doors, the cold calm of the court, the prosecutors who never called her by her name, just the accused. Every detail of her supposed crime was etched with a chisel, while every truth was ignored like dust on the floor. No one had wanted to hear the real story. Until now. The clink of keys at the door broke the stillness. She opened her eyes as the door slid open and Ben stepped into the room. He looked exhausted, eyes bloodshot, shirt wrinkled from hours without sleep. But his expression was steady. He closed the door behind him and nodded to the guard who stepped away, granting them privacy. Ben moved toward her and sat down slowly on the bench across from her cot. "They're moving fast," he said. "The court has ordered a full evidentiary hearing. The judge wants testimony from everyone who had a hand in your case." Elsie watched him with measured calm. "Everyone?" He nodded. "The original prosecutor is retired. Your public defender died 6 years ago. But the man who buried the investigation, who had the power to make everyone else stay silent, he's still here." She said nothing. Ben leaned forward slightly. "I need you to say his name, officially, on the record." She stared at him. "You already know who it is." "Yes," he said, "but knowing isn't enough. We need it spoken. We need it attached to testimony. If we're going to put a stop to this, if we're going to expose what happened, we need to drag him out of the dark." She closed her eyes. The memories came instantly. The voice on the phone, the sharpness in his tone even when he smiled, the way he'd looked at Lily when he thought no one was watching, the threats that came like whispers and the promises that came wrapped in silence. When she opened her eyes again, they were hard with something older than fear. Robert James Elwood. Ben sat back, the words settling into the air like the tolling of a bell. "He never cared about that boy," she said, voice low. "He only cared about what the mother knew, about the things she'd seen, about the names she'd written down. She told me once that he had secrets hidden in bank vaults, that if she ever disappeared, someone should look inside his charity accounts. I didn't understand what she meant. I don't think I wanted to, but I do now." Ben nodded but didn't interrupt. She tried to run. She was going to go to the state's attorney, hand over documents. She showed them to me, said she had evidence that could destroy his career. She cried when she told me, not because she was scared for herself, because she knew he'd never let their son walk free if it meant risking exposure. Elsie paused, her hands clutching the edges of the blanket beneath her. "So I took the boy," she continued. "When I found him alone, bruised, crying, his mother already gone, I ran, not to keep him for myself, not to hurt anyone, just to keep him from becoming another piece in that man's game. I thought I could disappear with him, keep him safe. But I underestimated how far Elwood's reach went. He didn't even need the police. His men came quietly, took the child, told the world I had kidnapped him, that I was delusional, dangerous. No one ever asked where the mother was. No one ever questioned why the father never appeared in court. It was like she had never existed, like he had never existed, only me, a woman with no money, no power, and too much truth in her hands." Ben felt the fire building in his chest. Rage, not for himself, but for her, for the world that had made her a villain because it was easier than facing the rot beneath its surface. "We're going to reopen every file," he said. "I already filed subpoenas for the hospital staff who treated Lily. I've contacted Karen Holtz again. She's willing to testify. And I found something else. A nurse from the clinic where Lily went for prenatal care. She remembers Elwood coming in, threatening the receptionist. There's a pattern, a trail." Elsie's voice was quiet. "Then follow it, but be careful. That man won't go down without trying to take someone with him." Ben hesitated, then leaned closer. "There's one more thing I need to ask you. The boy. Do you know what happened to him after they took him?" Her lips pressed together, her eyes, for the first time in hours, looked away. "No," she said softly. "Not for sure. I never saw him again. They told me he'd been returned to his family, but I think they moved him, hid him, maybe adopted out under a false name, or maybe worse. I don't know. But if he's still out there—" She trailed off. Ben finished for her. "We'll find him." There was silence between them again, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy with the knowledge of what they were about to unearth. Later that day, Elsie was moved to the medical wing for observation. Not because she was ill, but because the state now needed her alive. She was suddenly valuable. Her name, that no one had wanted to say, was now in headlines across the country. Woman on death row, saved by last-minute evidence. The story behind the silence. The congressman, the child, and the truth buried for 30 years. She read none of them. Instead, she spent her days watching the light on the wall shift with the hours. She thought often of Lily, of her laugh, her fierce heart, the way she had kissed her son's forehead like it was a blessing. Elsie still had the crescent pendant. She held it every night before sleep, whispering a name only she remembered. 2 days later, Ben returned with new information. "They lied about the boy," he said. "He was never placed in foster care. The adoption records were falsified. We tracked down the woman listed as his guardian. She doesn't exist. It was a shell identity. We think he may have been moved out of state." Elsie closed her eyes. "Keep going," she said, "no matter where it leads." Ben placed a document in her hand. "This is a sworn affidavit from a man who worked Elwood's campaign in the 90s. He heard him brag about cleaning up the mess with that nurse and her boy. We're adding it to the federal complaint." She didn't read it. She just held it. Another piece. Another crack in the wall. The final hearing was scheduled. Elsie would testify. The press would be there. The world that had forgotten her would have to watch. That night, as she lay in her cot beneath a thin sheet, she felt no peace. But she felt something close to purpose. Her voice, so long buried, was about to become a blade. And for the first time since the day she was arrested, she believed it might finally cut through the lies. She whispered a name into the dark. Not Elwood's. The boy's. And in that whisper, she remembered not the courtroom, not the headlines, not the cell. She remembered only the warmth of his small body in her arms and the way he had looked at her with perfect, trusting eyes. She had done what she could. Now the world had to answer. If you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for stories that matter. And don't forget to share this one with someone who needs to hear it.